and 7 Spanish angels took another angel home. Hey, I'm Willie Nelson, and you're watching HempRock TV.
Yes, marijuana. It has been used for thousands of years as a medicine. Now, as we approach the 21st century, is marijuana, cannabis, hemp, the answer for our health problems? This question was posed at a recent Science and Truth hearings held in Lexington, Kentucky. What you will see is a testimony of the 3 doctors, experts in their fields, along with patient testimony.
First of all, it's the #1 medicine on earth. A prosecutor asked me the other day, Gatewood, why do people smoke marijuana? And I said, because it's the #1 medicine for the #1 killer on earth, which is stress. People who smoke marijuana live a year to a year and a half longer than people who don't, because it helps you breathe and helps you think. And people find that relaxing.
Get into why you got into it at that. Dr. Grinspoon, as I have told you during the time we spent together last night, I'm trying to keep this format as free-flowing as possible. What I would like for you to do is you've taken my request to appear here to discuss, will marijuana as a medicine cut the cost of health care in the state, in the Commonwealth of Kentucky? But what I would like to do is give you free hand to, in your own style, to present to us and the audience how you came to be a researcher in the field of marijuana. And please take your time, sir. We'll interrupt and try to be as least disruptive as we can in our interruptions. But I'd like you, in your own style, please give us a presentation as to how you've come to be able to testify to this question.
Thank you, Gatewood. Distinguished panel. I first became interested in marijuana in 1967 as a consequence of the fact that I was asked to testify at the trial of 2 Harvard students. I can even remember their names, which is amazing. Lice and Weiss. 2 students who were picked up at Logan Airport for possessing marijuana. And I was asked to testify because I had written an essay on how inappropriate it was for the criminal justice system to be involved in this problem in the first place. I knew nothing about marijuana. Now, as I began to learn about marijuana, I became more and more interested. And it was my view at that time that lots of very foolish young people were using this terribly dangerous drug, and that the reason they persisted in doing this, despite the fact that their elders were telling them this was very unhealthy for them, was because they simply didn't believe the information that was being used to support this prescription. And I decided at that time in 1967 that I would attempt to look at all of the scientific and medical, and in fact I went into a lot of the lay literature on marijuana, that if I could present an objectively sound account of the dangers of this drug, that maybe young people would begin to listen to this. So over the course of the next 3 years, I began an intensive study of cannabis, of marijuana, and I came to the startling realization that I had been brainwashed like everybody else in the country. And the reason the title of that first book, which was published by Harvard University Press, was Marijuana Reconsidered, is because I was the one that had to reconsider what I thought I knew about this substance. The book concluded that while marijuana is certainly not a harmless drug, there's no such thing as a harmless drug, it was orders of magnitude less harmful than either of the two licitly available, commonly used licitly available drugs, alcohol and tobacco, and that I naively believed that once people really understood that they would move to legalize marijuana, and I predicted within 10 years. One of the chapters in Marijuana Reconsidered had to do with the therapeutic utilities of cannabis. And this is something that has continued to interest me over the course of the years, especially since in 1972 I had a personal experience with its its remarkable medical utilities, and I persisted in this interest but did very little about it. Most of the time between 1971 and the time I began to work on the book that Galbraith mentioned was occupied with, where marijuana is concerned, attempting to deal with the new myths which had grown up about marijuana. I mean, the first book I did, Marijuana Reconsidered, was very largely an attempt to demythologize it. Mind you, in 1971, people believed such hoary notions that marijuana is addicting, that it leads to crime, that it leads to so-called stepping stone hypothesis, that it leads to the use of so-called harder drugs, that it leads to sexual excess, whatever that is, that it causes all sorts of brain damage and so forth and so on. After 1971, the so-called new research, the federal government really cranked up and put millions of dollars into a very extensive research program which attempted to find the toxicity in cannabis which would justify its prohibition of this drug, which would justify the fact that approximately 400,000 mostly young people, were being arrested every year in connection with this drug, mostly for use. It was very clear to me that whatever the harmfulness of marijuana was, whatever the inherent psychopharmacological properties of marijuana, which might be considered harmful, they were in no way as harmful as the damage that was being imposed on these young people by criminalizing many of them and arresting about 400,000 a year. So the activity on my part, where marijuana was concerned, was largely devoted to trying to put into perspective these new claims about marijuana. For example, in 1972, Dr. Kolodny from the University of St. Louis published a paper in which he claimed that the use of marijuana caused a significant decrement in testosterone in males. And you know, the interesting thing is the newspapers would cover that, big headlines. But when, of course, the attempts to replicate that study, just to give that as an indication, demonstrated that this was simply not the case, there was very little newspaper or media coverage of that, and people today, even today, are left with a notion that cannabis leads to diminution of testosterone. There were, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but there were developed a Campbell study on cannabis brain, the Tulane studies on that, the people at Harvard who claimed that marijuana led to the development of breasts in young males. All of these achieved a great deal of media coverage, but when the serious work which attempted to replicate these things were demonstrated that there was nothing to it, the media doesn't cover that. So, for example, the public has an impression of marijuana which is fueled by organizations like Pride, which suggests that it is much more harmful than it really is. The bottom line here, and I'm sure the panel will have a lot of questions about this, for both me and Dr. Morgan and Dr. Mikuriya, about just what is the actual harm potential of this drug. But the bottom line is that, and I can certainly go into this in more detail later, the bottom line is that when marijuana takes its rightful place in the pharmacopoeia, it will clearly be the drug which is among the least toxic, if not the least toxic, of all the drugs that are used by physicians today. Now, a few years ago, I decided that I didn't want to go on just constantly refuting the various kinds of claims that were made in the attempt to justify the government position. Even the government became a little frustrated because, after all of this research and coming up with very little, they decided, well, the problem is that people in the United States don't use very much of this drug, and if we're really going to see what the toxicity is, we should go abroad. And so they financed 3 studies: the Vera Rubin study in Jamaica, the SAT study in Costa Rica, and the Stefana study in Greece. And to make a long story short, each of these studies, very briefly speaking, involved about 30 experimental subjects and about 30, that is, they varied from study to study, control subjects. All of the subjects were people who had used cannabis for many years. The average, if you take the average of the 3 studies, about 17 and a half years. All of the experimental subjects were people who used cannabis heavily, about 7 marijuana joints, or splees, as they're called in Jamaica, a year. All of it was potent marijuana. And comparing these subjects in each case to a control group, these studies were able to come up with very, very little of any significance.
Doctor, let me interrupt for a second. You misspoke, I believe. You said an average of 7 splees a year. Did you mean a day?
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So the average in this 17 and a half years of use, and an average of 7 marijuana cigarettes or splees a day.
Yes, that's correct. Thank you for correcting me.
Yes, sir. And could, in one sentence, could you give the bottom line as to, was this group distinguishable from the non-users?
There were absolutely no statistically significant differences between these 2 groups. As I say, all 3 studies really came up with goose eggs.
Did they analyze lung function?
Pardon?
I assume these are inhalers.
That's correct.
And did they analyze lung function? Or?
Yes, the Jamaica study demonstrated some pulmonary effects, but not reaching significance. Now, you put your finger, Dr. Poundhouse, on, if you were to ask me, well, are you concerned about any of the, what are you concerned about where the health of cannabis is concerned? And of all these studies that have been done, the one area that I would be concerned with is with the pulmonary. effects. I mean, the lungs weren't made to breathe in any kind of smoke of any kind of vegetable matter. That's just a fact. Furthermore, you take the fact that cannabis smoke has 3 to 4 times as much tar as tobacco smoke, and even more, you burn even more carbon monoxide. It's not a very healthy thing to do. But if you look at that for a minute, I mean, you know, when there was people who smoke cigarettes who get into difficulty, either pulmonary carcinoma, emphysema, heart problems, so forth and so on. These are people who, of course, achieve, at the very minimum, 20-pack years. I can smoke a pack a day for 20 years, or 2 packs a day for 10 years, and so forth. There are very few people who use cannabis who get anywhere even allowing for the fact that the cannabis smoke contains more tar, even allowing for that.
But doctor, isn't that only because it's not available and not acceptable legally? If it were, would they not smoke cannabis as heavily as they use tobacco?
No, for 2 reasons. One, first of all, and I'll get to that, but let me just finish what I said. There isn't now imagine all the people who are looking for the deleterious effects of cannabis. There has never been reported a case of bronchogenic carcinoma or emphysema that can be attributed to cannabis. And, you know, we've been using it now. You know, people say, well, you can't compare it with cigarettes because we've had a lot of years to look at that. And Dole and Hill made their first observation in the 1950s, Everts Graham in about 1956. But in fact, cannabis has been smoked for many years, not just in this country, but elsewhere, and not a single case yet. Now, about your question, there are 2 reasons why that's not true. One, as was demonstrated by Florence Halpern, who was an investigator with the LaGuardia Commission. You may remember that Mayor LaGuardia was very doubtful of what the government had done in passing the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937, asking the New York Academy of Medicine to undertake an investigation. She was one of the, I think there were 17 people involved in that investigation. And she was able to demonstrate that you offer these 77 subjects as much cannabis ad libitum, and they only took enough to achieve the desired high. Secondly, cannabis has a remarkable self-regulatory inherent psychopharmacological property. That is to say, the more you smoke, the less you get out of it. If you smoke the equivalent of, let's say, 10 joints a day, you will get very little of the high out of it. People generally don't do this unless they just care about smoking in much the way cigarettes smokers do. And then thirdly, you see, when cannabis becomes a medicine, and American technology is put to the task of separating what is useful in cannabis from what is deleterious, namely the particulate matter that goes into the lungs, it will be possible to pretty much eliminate that problem. In fact, it seems to me very foolish on the part of the American government to make it, to move against the paraphernalia stores, because using water pipes, using smokeless pipes and so forth is exactly calculated to separate out this particulate matter. And as I say, when it becomes available as a medicine, that will not be a problem. That is the biggest concern that I have at the present time. from the point of view of health. Now, excuse me.
Go ahead, Doctor.
Well, I thought I would begin to get into the medical aspect.
My next question was going to be, was there any particular thing that fueled, any particular occurrence or event that fueled your personal interest in researching this matters of medicine?
Well, there was an event in my life which of course was critical, and that is, let me just take a few minutes to tell the story so that in 1972, this was a year after my book Marijuana Reconsidered had been published, Sidney Farber, who was the, I don't know what that means, it certainly means something, there was physicians on the panel. He was at Harvard, he was the premier children's oncologist. In fact, Sidney Farber Research Center at the Children's Hospital at Harvard is named as now. It's the Sidney Farber unit. When he died, his successor was chosen from a man from Houston, Texas, by the name of Emil Fry. I was asked by a fellow faculty member if I would be interested in joining him at his house for dinner, if I'd be interested in meeting Emil Fry. At that dinner, Dr. Fry said, he asked me now, he knew that in my book, Marijuana Reconsidered, apparently he was familiar with the book, but I had gone into the 19th century use of cannabis as a medicine. It was very much used as a medicine in this country in the 19th century. And he said to me, is there anything in the 19th century literature which would support the following story? And he went on to tell me the story of an 18-year-old young man in Houston whom he was treating for acute lymphatic leukemia with cancer chemotherapies. The nausea and vomiting became so severe in this young man, as it does with so many people, that he threatened to stop taking the medicine. He simply couldn't stand it. This is a nausea and vomiting that can go on for hours, even days. People, I know one person that break a clavicle, people can rupture their esophagus. It's not just the vomiting with the dry heaves. It's a dreadful situation. This young man, as I say, threatened to stop taking the medicine. They had to coerce him into it, cajole him into it. And he said suddenly one day, this man took the medicine, no objection to it, no vomiting afterwards, seemed perfectly happy about the whole thing, and they were consternated. Came in the next time, 2 weeks later, took the medicine again, and with the same consequences. Finally, someone on Dr. Fry's staff asked him, what's going on here, Jimmy? And Jimmy told him that he had smoked dope 20 minutes before he took the medicine and prevented the nausea. And Dr. Fry said to him, well, is there anything to that? Do you think there's anything to it? And I said, yes, there is information in the 19th century. Of course, we didn't have cancer chemotherapies. There's something new the last couple of decades. But there is, it certainly does, there is in the 19th century literature information that suggests it is an anti-nausea. Now, on the way home that night, my wife asked me if we could get hold of some cannabis for Danny. Danny was our 15-year-old son who had leukemia and was going through these cancer chemotherapies. I, being the stuffed shirt that I tend to be, said, no, we can't do that. It's against the law. And we wouldn't want to embarrass the people at the Children's Hospital with this. 2 weeks later, when Danny had his next treatment, I would walk over from my office to the Children's Hospital, the treatment rooms, and Usually when I arrived, my wife and child were very, very anxious. One could cut that anxiety with a knife. I walked in this time and there wasn't a hint of anxiety. In fact, they seemed to be playing a joke on me. Finally, they let me in on it that Betsy had gone to the Wellesley High School on her way into the hospital, asked Danny's friend Mark if he could get a small amount of marijuana for her. Mark, once he recovered from his shock, ran off and came back with some marijuana. Danny smoked marijuana in the parking lot of the Children's Hospital before he went into the treatment room. He took the medicine, and instead of vomiting, he asked for a submarine sandwich. Now, mind you, Danny, every time he got this, would vomit. He'd vomit in the car on the way home. He would vomit for about 8 hours. Not vomit, but have dry heaves. Had to be over a big bucket in his bedroom. Had to have the door closed and stuff so he couldn't smell any food coming from the kitchen. It was really a pretty dreadful situation. This time, Danny asked for a submarine sandwich, got home, went back to school, went about his business. I was dumbfounded. I called Dr. Norman Jaffe the next day, the man who was taking care of Danny, and told him about this and said, look, Norman, I can't refuse to let Danny take the cannabis the next time he has his treatment. And Dr. Jaffe said, look, Lester, have him do it, have him smoke it right here in the treatment room. I want to see this for myself. And Danny did this. The results were exactly the same. And then, in fact, Dr. Jaffe and I went up to see Dr. Emil Fry, who was equally impressed, and he then put in motion the first study. The first study of this that was done was a study that was published in the New England Journal of Medicine by Salin, Fry, and Zinberg, where people were given not cannabis, because the government wouldn't allow to do it, but tetrahydrocannabinol. And the fact of the matter is that Danny smoked cannabis for the rest of his life over the next year, and it made quite a bit of difference in the quality of his life and that of his parents. So, to go on with my story, I continue to, while I felt that this so-called new research, which Pride people and the other anti-marijuana propaganda people were using, it was important to refute this, and I would look at these papers and analyze them and so forth. At the same time, I became increasingly concerned that I was spending so much of my time on that side of the coin, and there was another side to the cannabis coin. That is to say that this drug has some remarkable utilities which we're not paying any attention to because we're so obsessed with this notion of the question of just how harmful it is. And I decided to do a study of the salutary effects of cannabis, of which the medical ones are, of course, very important. And it's for that reason that a couple of years ago I began this work on, which has culminated on this book. This is a copy of the page proofs. The book will come out in May. On the medical utilities of cannabis, and that is what I'd like to spend a few minutes talking about.
At this point, I'm going to ask you to do that. Just one last thing, I want to go back just a little bit. In a story, I want to go back to the kinds of research that says that marijuana has various dilatory effects. I want to do it very briefly with you, and then I'll be asking other witnesses, specifically Drs. Mikuriya and Morgan, this. But in the media investigation of these hearings. When the media went out to report these hearings, of course they took statements from me, and then they, in their duty, they felt, I guess, that it was their duty to try to get some opposite views. And in the media story that appeared in the local paper, Doctor, they quote Dr. Herbert Kleber, Executive Vice President of the Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse and a professor of psychiatry at Columbia University. Dr. Kleber says that, number one, there is no strong evidence that it is useful as a medicine, and that he says there's evidence of harmful effects of marijuana, including impairment of motor skills, anxiety, and disruption of the body's immune system. As briefly as you can, Doctor, that being the position taken by various people who have an anti-marijuana bias, or can be proven to have that, are his statements true? Is it a fact that there is no strong evidence that marijuana is a medicine?
Well, you see, it depends on what you describe as strong evidence. Nowadays, the desideratum for the therapeutic utility of a drug is the double-blind study. A double-blind study simply means that, let's say, we have 100 patients with multiple sclerosis, and they suffer from muscle spasm, as most of them do. We take half of them and give them a placebo. A placebo, a capsule that contains sugar or some pharmacologically inactive substance. We give the other half, the same capsule, looks exactly the same, but we put an active medicine in it. And then we have dispassionate observers who don't know anything about what's in those capsules, make notations, collect the data on which of those kinds of capsules were most useful to these people. That's the double-blind study, and that is, as I say, the way that we collect strong, I think that's what he means when he says strong evidence of therapeutic utility. Now, the trouble with cannabis is, because it's been illegal, because it's been a Schedule I drug, it's been impossible to do these kinds of large clinical double-blind studies. It's a catch-22. The government says you have to have this kind of information, but the investigator who tries to do it, now the government says, well, you really can do it. But for example, Alfred Kranzer, who in 1970, I believe it is, did the first study of driving in cannabis, he finally got cannabis from and permission from the federal government, but as he says, it took the equivalent of 1 year of his professional life to do all the paperwork and everything that was, all the hoops that were demanded by the government, and he would never study cannabis again. As a consequence, there is an extraordinary paucity of studies of cannabis in any double-blind way. And what one has to rely upon and what this book is mostly concerned with, is anecdotal evidence. Now, anecdotal evidence is that is to say, you look at individual patients and their experience. Anecdotal evidence, medicine was built on anecdotal evidence. For example, the drugs like aspirin, chloral hydrate, penicillin, insulin, these are all drugs that came into being as therapeutic substances without the benefit of double-blind studies. Or even today, for example, if you look at what's happened to minoxidil, for example, minoxidil is a product that was developed by Upjohn as an antihypertensive agent. It was discovered anecdotally that if you rub some of it on your scalp, it grows hair. The Upjohn people now sell minoxidil. I mean, it isn't sold as an antihypertensive agent. It's sold as something that will.
That's not true. Minoxidil, when it was used in females, made a lot of women hairy. They couldn't figure out why these women were getting so hairy. And they realized it was directly related to the drug, that people who took the drug were becoming very hairy. They then realized that you could probably rub it on and get the same effect because it was a local effect. That's how the drug got here. The drug is still available, and it's a very good antihypertensive. So people who take the drug, it's a very good agent, as it is today. This is a very good side effect of an agent that was put to good use.
What I meant, Dr. DeSimone, is that the discovery that rubbing it on was quite accidental and reported anecdotally, and that now it's the sales of minoxidil as a substance which produces hair is much more Upjohn. This is much more important to Upjohn than its use as an antihypertensive. Or if you take the drug Retin A, for example, which was first developed as a treatment for acne, it was again discovered that quite by accident that it minimizes wrinkles. Then control studies were done, and now it's sold as an anti-wrinkle medicine. And in fact, even now, it's being looked at because it seems to remove liver spots. They're the spots that as people get older, they get little brown spots, presumably from exposure to the sun. And this relieves that kind of thing. So anecdotal evidence plays a very important part in medicine. So when I think Klaber is saying, he uses the word strong evidence, he's saying we don't have solid double-blind studies. But I think that even he would not deny that anecdotal evidence is important. I mean, there's no question. Anecdotal evidence has always been a problem for medicine. It's the problem of the anecdotal fallacy, or the fallacy of the enumeration of favorable results. It goes like this. Let's say we have a person with multiple sclerosis. He discovers that he gets remarkable relief of the muscle spasms from cannabis. He and his physician are likely to become real proselytes. Boy, you know that I can get, but we don't know how many. Maybe he's 1 in 100, maybe he's 1 in 1,000. So that's the problem with anecdotal evidence.
May I interrupt you for a second, Doctor, unless someone else want to interrupt you first? I would ask, there is a great push on to allow the FDA approval of a lot of drugs on the market, cutting down the testing period, the time period of the test. And I believe that there's a big push on by the pharmaceutical companies to cut short that testing period. They're saying, well, these drugs, we may not know everything we need to know about them, but it looks like it may bring some relief here, especially with the emphasis on AIDS, etc. Is there, in fact, number one, a push on to cut the testing period prior to putting new drugs on the market? And number two, are they looking at bypassing double-blind studies in order to facilitate putting these drugs on the market?
Well, that kind of a push has come from the AIDS community, which has been, understandably impatient with the pace of the development of these new drugs. In our country, the way new drugs come into being, a drug company discovers or buys the rights to a chemical, if it believes that this chemical has therapeutic utility, it will then go ahead and file an so-called IND and begin the kind of testing that is required. The estimates are that the drug company will spend an average of $260 million to make this chemical into a shelf pharmaceutical. You ask, well, why will they spend this much money? They get a patent on this substance, and for 17 years, they have 17 years to recoup their investment, and the investment against a lot of drugs that failed in this. And so that's why they charge an awful lot of money for drugs like this. Now, the process takes an average of 3 years, and that is where these folks have become quite impatient, and the FDA is attempting to try and streamline that. And as I say, the push has come largely from the AIDS community.
Doctor, I was interested in hearing your response to a comment that Gatewood read from the newspaper. Dr. Cleaver, was that Dr. Cleaver's comment that the use of marijuana could hinder or hamper the immune system?
Yes. Now, that is just not true. The first paper on cannabis and the immune system was published in Science in 1973 by a man by the name of Nahas. Since then, attempts to replicate that have failed. Now, cannabis does have I think, some connection with the immune system, but there is no evidence that whatever the connection is, that it in any way compromises a person's capacity to fight off infection. I mean, if you just think about it for a minute, with all these young people who are using cannabis, if you looked at the population 18 to 25, and not only do they smoke cannabis, but they pass the joint around. Imagine somebody has flu or some such thing. What better way to do it than to share a marijuana cigarette or a joint? There is absolutely no evidence that there's been any kind of a blip in any kind of an increase in any infectious disease in that group. Furthermore, you take the people with AIDS the whole thing about AIDS is that it's a virus which compromises the immune system. There was recently completed a study, I think, of several thousand homosexual people, many of them with AIDS, and it was demonstrated that there was no indication that their use of cannabis affected the immune system at all, or in any way shortened their lifetime. The bottom line of the immune thing is that nobody believes that it has any practical effect on a person's capacity, the immune system's capacity to deal with either infection or cancer.
Well, Doctor, you said that you thought the only possibly harmful effect of cannabis would be on the pulmonary system. But to the naked eye, there is at least a cosmetic side effect. There are the red-rimmed eyes of the cannabis user. What is the physiological reason for that? Is it harmful?
No, it's absolutely not harmful. There are a couple of physiological effects. One is, as you say, a hyperemia of the sclera, a reddening of the eyes. That's a temporary thing that goes away. It has no harmful effects whatsoever. And the other constant physiological effect is an increase in the heart rate. But again, when I play tennis, my heart rate goes up too. And as far as anybody knows, the consequences of that are benign.
Dr. Eastman, we have now, you're sitting up there. Some of your actions remind me in the courtroom while the other side's testifying, Doctor.
I just don't want to wait to be finished and then
we can certainly take a break now as far as allowing your questions regarding the deleterious effects of marijuana. When you finish with that, or when everybody finishes with that, then I would like to launch into what areas of medicine his research indicates may be beneficial to.
But that's what I was hoping that
okay,
I'd ask him some questions.
Okay, fine. Doctor, at this time, could you enlighten us as to what categories of ailments and illnesses and impairments that marijuana as a medicine might be helpful with?
When I just look at the table of contents of this book as a kind of outline, and I'll try to be very brief about this. The first area which I've already mentioned is the treatment of the nausea and vomiting of cancer chemotherapy. The most exciting development in the treatment of cancer for the past 2 decades has been the elaboration of these cancer chemotherapeutic substances. They are truly life-saving, not always, but very often life-saving medicines. There are a number of they're very toxic substances, obviously, because they kill cancer cells and presumably, hopefully don't kill normal cells. But of course, there's a lot of conflation in this issue. Now, as a consequence, people who take this very often lose all their hair, have other very serious side effects. But the side effect which, in many ways, is most toxic is the severe nausea and vomiting. It can be so severe that people have said, I'd rather deal with the disease than take this medicine anymore. In other words, the nausea and vomiting is life-threatening because it instills this kind of fear in people. And furthermore, it's so powerful that people develop a kind of conditioned reflex. There are people who when they meet someone on the treatment team in the grocery store or on the street have a condition, they start to vomit because of the conditioned reflex. This vomiting, as I said before, can go on for a very long time. They lose their interest in food, and it adds to the weight loss, which they're already struggling with. There are conventional medicines which counter that, the most important being compazine or prochlorperazine, and a new drug called ondansetron, or Zofran. Now, about approximately 65 or 70% of people will find those conventional medicines satisfactory, and they do away with the nausea and vomiting. But the other folks have to go through this. They're ineffective, and they go through this nausea and vomiting. In one study of 56 people who didn't respond to the conventional medicines for nausea and vomiting, 78% of them did respond to cannabis. In this book, I present the stories of some of these people who failed with these other drugs but found cannabis to be such a boon. Now you may say, as many physicians do, why not use the available drug Marijuana, which is a synthetic tetrahydrocannabinol being one of the cannabinoids and the most active one among the more than 60 found in the cannabis plant. And in 1985, the government made it possible for people, it moved Marinol or dronabinol, this THC, to Schedule II, so it can be prescribed for cancer chemotherapy, and in fact, recently cannot be prescribed for the nausea and vomiting of AIDS. But the difficulty is that while it is useful, it's not as useful as whole smoked cannabis. An investigator by the name of Chang in 1978 took 15 patients with bone cancer and did the following study. Very briefly, he took cannabis cigarettes, which had no cannabinoids in them. He extracted it and just put the tobacco part of it, the leaf part of it back. And then he made 4 grades of cannabis cigarettes in terms of potency. And he compared, to make a long story short, what he discovered was that, first of all, it's very difficult to give a pill like Marijuana to somebody who's vomiting, who's very nauseous, but they can smoke. Secondly, he was able to demonstrate that the effectiveness of the anti-nausea, anti-emetic effect of cannabis was directly related to the blood level of THC, and that oral cannabis, or taking it more as Marinol in a pill form, was very unreliable in how it, what kind of a blood level it achieved. But that if you smoked it, and if you smoked a more potent cannabis, you could get a higher blood level, and you could minimize. With the group who smoked potent cigarettes, only 6%, in only 6% of people was he unsuccessful in blocking the vomiting. In the people who took the Marinol, 44% of them continued to vomit. So, point one, it's very effective as an anti-nausea and anti-emetic, and 2, it's more effective as a smoked substance than it is as an oral substance.
In that category of ailments and treatments, I think we should specify a category if any of you folks, before you move on to another category. One that I'm interested in too is the anorexic effect of nutrition blocking diseases such as tuberculosis and AIDS, which I guess also encompasses the vomiting and nausea effect.
I'll get to that.
Yes, sir. But as far as what Dr. Grinspoon said, as far as the category of ailments, ailment of combating nausea and the sickness effects of cancer treatment, there are very specific questions on this in panel members.
I need to explain who I am. I've been an oncologist since 1970 in here. I spent some years in Vietnam and experimented, not while I was in Vietnam, with this stuff, not much like our president tried. I was on the original studies in the mid-70s on marijuana, and actually have given marijuana to patients. There is a therapeutic effect. At least in Kentuckians, it's different than you would expect somewhere else. My information is only in Kentucky. We could get marijuana anytime we wanted it just by sending someone to their local sheriff. And so that we started out to study patients who would take marijuana. First of all, older people would not do it. Older people in Kentucky would not smoke marijuana. They would even not take THC or Marinol because of what it meant. And so the social strata of it was not as good as what someone would have thought it would have been. The patients who smoked marijuana, and obviously there were some, anecdotally, there were some patients who actually did very well. Most of them vomited in oblivion. So that they didn't mind being sick so much, and which was all right. The idea that they could smoke their cigarette and not be sick was very, very good. And there is a phenomena of patients coming in to see us, so they see you and they get sick. They got sick, but they didn't mind getting sick when they were smoking their marijuana. The things have since then changed, really. The studies that compared THC, the Mirinol, to something else was done before the studies of ondansetron. Ondansetron is a wonderful agent, and I was very skeptical of its use because I didn't think that it would ever be as good as people touted it as. It is close to 90% effective in the treatment of cancer patients who get vomiting from their drugs. Obviously, it's very expensive, but it is very, very, very good in controlling the patients who have nausea and vomiting secondary to the chemotherapy.
Dr. DeSimone, let me interrupt you for a second. When you say very, very, very expensive, what costs are you talking about in this treatment?
A couple $100 a treatment. Now, if what I've been hearing about the cost of a nickel bag, when I was young it was a nickel bag, the stuff now it goes for, in the state of Kentucky, $60 for a quarter of an ounce.
Outstripped inflation.
And then I'm told in California this morning it's $120 an ounce, a quarter of an ounce. And so that maybe the cost wouldn't be much different if it takes 4 or 5 cigarettes to get you where you need to be.
Well, let me ask you, as Dr. Grinspoon pointed out, Dr. DeSimone, and currently I'm actually going to be a devil's advocate to all of us up here, including myself, to bring a drug to market. Once they discover a chemical and its potential therapeutic uses, and they go through all the studies, and they go through the packaging, and they go through the marketing surveys, etc., Dr. Grinspoon announced the almost unbelievable figure of $216 million from the time they get this chemical or the compound to the time they have it in a package on the shelf. Was that figure correct, Dr. Grinspoon?
It's an average figure,
yes. Yes, sir. When the pharmaceutical companies who are the producers of these drugs that you're talking about, Dr. DeSimone, when they finally get these to market, don't they in fact have to charge those kinds of prices because they have such a development cost already invested in them? And secondly, once they recoup that development cost, are you familiar with any pharmaceutical company that then cut its prices?
The cost is related to the number of people who use the drug. Obviously, let's just take red name. It was very expensive. It still is very expensive. But people, as we are very vain, regardless of who we are. We don't want wrinkles. We don't want pimples. And so that the more people use it, the cost goes down. It's just like any demand and effect. In nausea, in chemotherapy, we don't have any patients, so the cost really is. And I'm not here to defend drug companies, please. I think they make a lot of money on us. But they're trying to recoup some of their own costs. It would go down as soon as you can find more and more uses of it. Yes.
May I address?
Hello. May I address Dr. Simone's remarks for a moment? You know, it's perfectly true that marijuana now costs maybe $75 a quarter ounce, but that's an artificial price, a consequence of the prohibition. In my future, marijuana, my fantasy of the future, marijuana is a medicine. What will it cost to produce as a medicine? Maybe $1 an ounce. Add $3 to $4 for wholesale costs. 60 grams in an ounce. Most cigarettes are about about a half a gram. So that makes 30 grams to an ounce. That makes 60 marijuana cigarettes to an ounce. The patient who would be taking cannabis as an anti-nauseant would smoke maybe a quarter of a cigarette. That's pennies. Take ondansetron. Ondansetron requires that a patient be admitted to a hospital or a facility where he can receive ondansetron intravenously. The cost is estimated to be about $600 per treatment. Now that's, if you talk about medical costs, that's, ondansetron, it's true, is 90% effective in preventing this nausea and vomiting. But cannabis is at least 90% effective and much, by orders of magnitude, less expensive. So, well, perhaps I should move on to the next. We're going to be stuck with cancer for a long time.
Well, yes. What I want to suggest at this time, and I'm not sure about the effects. I'm not sure about the format here. Something has arisen, and I need about a 5-minute break in proceedings. Would it be efficacious for you folks to continue with these proceedings, or may I ask if any of us can use a 5-minute break at this point in time before we go into the additional testimony, Dr. Grinspoon? Do you folks feel? I think a 5-minute break would probably lend an air of relaxation to the finale of this morning's proceedings. So with everybody's permission, I want to call a 5 to 7 minute recess in proceedings. At this time, 12:15, maximum 12:30. We'll recess for an hour, 15 minutes or so. But doctor, up until now we've discussed your general background, qualifications. We've talked about some of the motivations for you to begin studying this substance as a medicine. We've talked about your response to some of the negative comments made by other professionals who may or may not be objective about the situation. And at this point, we have talked about one category of ailment with which you are convinced that marijuana is a viable medicine which deals with nausea associated with chemoradiation therapy. There are other areas of ailments, as I stated earlier, anorexia associated with nutrition-blocking diseases like tuberculosis, AIDS, and I assume brain tumors and some of tumors placed, cancer tumors, etc. Do you have anything more that you want to add onto the category of nausea associated with cancer treatment? And if so, or if not, would you then move on to other areas of ailments and impairments with which your research indicates that marijuana may be a viable medicine?
Yes, thank you. First of all, let me say that this can't be a comprehensive list, but let me go over the highlights of what I think are the urgent areas that have to be addressed now. There are patients out there who are suffering and who need this substance now. The next one that I'd like to address is glaucoma. Very briefly, Dr. Poundhouse, at the risk of... Dr. Poundstone and Dr. DeSimone, at the risk of boring them, let me just say that glaucoma is a disease of the eyes. It's the second most common cause of blindness. It is a failure of the regulatory system, which, in order for the eye to work, it has to be nearly spherical. It's kept spherical by keeping a relatively constant pressure in the fluid inside the eye. In a disease called glaucoma, wide angle or open angle glaucoma, which is of the two, constitutes about 90% of glaucoma patients. The channel which allows the fluid flowing in to flow out fails, and this pressure goes up. This can lead to loss of vision and ultimately, in what's called end-stage glaucoma, to blindness. The available medicines are not terribly satisfactory in that, because time presses, I won't go into that. But it was discovered by a man by the name of Hepler in Los Angeles that cannabis has the effect of lowering intraocular pressure. It's remarkably effective at doing this. It is clear that for some patients, for example, the first patient to receive an IND from the U.S. government is a man by the name of Randall, who in 1976 received this IND, and he believes that smoking marijuana has saved his eyesight. And certainly there are a lot of ophthalmologists who support that notion. So this is another area in which cannabis is useful. Now, Randall and these other people who use cannabis for the treatment of glaucoma smoke it, but it's altogether possible that eventually a topical application, a way of putting it directly on the eye, will be developed. But in the meantime, smoking it is the only avenue available to them.
Can I ask what drug, pharmaceutical drug is being used for treatment for this disease? And do you have any idea of the costs of that drug?
I can tell you what drugs are being used, but I have no idea what the cost
Could you just enumerate the drugs that are purchased for that, and we'll get into the cost with another witness.
Well, the most common ones are pilocarpine, which unfortunately makes it very difficult for people to see when they use it. The so-called beta blockers are helpful to people, and various kinds of agents which limit fluid, that are taken systemically and limit fluid production in the body. Sorry, I'll have to tie this hand down. are useful, but none of them clearly as useful as cannabis. So people who have had the experience of both the conventional medicines and cannabis make it very clear that the easiest way to do it, the least expensive way to do it, and the way which seems to vouchsafe, preserving eyesight in a patient with glaucoma is to try and keep that pressure from getting out beyond the teens at any time, getting above 20 at any time. The way that when a person smokes cannabis, for 4 to 5 hours, his pressure stays below 20. And no other visual function is affected. It allows them to see, color vision, binocular vision, all these things are intact.
But it's a very temporary relief?
Yes, only for 4 or 5 hours, and in fact, Randall, who is the most famous of these patients, smokes about 10 joints a day in controlling his glaucoma.
Any questions as far as the category of glaucoma, gentlemen? All right. Dr. Grinspoon, what other categories of ailments does your study indicate?
Well, let me go on next to epilepsy. You know, cannabis has been used for thousands of years as a medicine. The first notation, the first written account of this goes back about 5,000 years to the Emperor Shen Nung. But the first entrance into Western medical literature was provided by a British physician working in Calcutta whose name was O'Shaughnessy. And he, looking at the Indians and the Malays and the way they use this medicine, discovered that cannabis was very useful for the treatment of various convulsive diseases. And in fact, since his paper was published in 1839, one can find about 100 papers. He started the Western medical interest in cannabis, and there are about 100 papers in the Western medical literature between that time and the close of the 19th century. Now, people suffering from epilepsy today, there are various kinds of epilepsy. To be very brief, there's grand mal epilepsy with all the musculature involved in that, and then there are various kinds of what are called partial epilepsies, or the older name was psychomotor epilepsy. Only about 75% of people who suffer from epilepsy get good relief from conventional medicines. It has been discovered that both with respect to grand mal epilepsy, but particularly with regard to the partial epilepsies, cannabis is very useful. And it's again a pity. One of the people who writes for this book is a man who suffers from both grand mal and partial epilepsy. And he writes his account from a jail cell because, like so many people who use cannabis for medicinal purposes, they get to the point where they want to be sure they don't run out of the stuff. And so and also it's so expensive on the street, he grew his own. He was apprehended by the police officials, and sadly he had to write his account from jail, where he was having regular convulsive seizures. The next thing I'd like to go on to is multiple sclerosis. Now, multiple sclerosis is a disorder of the central nervous system, which it's a demyelinization disease. Myelin is the covering of the nerves. It's almost like you have an electric wire and the insulation, right? It's like the insulation comes off. And it's thought to be a kind of autoimmune disease. It affects lots of people, particularly starting fairly young. It is the manifestations are quite protean. The course of the disease is very variable. Some people have just a couple of attacks and stabilize. Some people go on and deteriorate terribly. The lifespan is generally about 30 years. And because it affects the central nervous system and can affect it anywhere, the symptoms are likely to be something like tingling or inability to ataxia, inability to coordinate and walk, difficulty with vision, all sorts of things. Now, one of the consequences of multiple sclerosis is that people get a very severe muscle spasm. Just as it sounds, the muscle goes into spasm and it's very painful. This has traditionally or conventionally been treated with 3 drugs: baclofen, dantrolene, and diazepam or Valium. Baclofen and dantrolene are of marginal utility, and dantrolene has some serious side effects, including the possibility of serious involvement of the liver. Valium tends to be more effective, but people have to take it in very large doses, up to 40 milligrams a day, which is a dose that makes them very dopey at the very least, and runs the risk of their becoming addicted to this benzodiazepine. People have discovered that if they smoke a small amount of cannabis, it relieves the muscle spasm. The story with cannabis is even more impressive where multiple sclerosis is concerned, because a number of people, particularly women, have reported, one of the things they do, particularly women, have trouble with bladder control. It affects that part of the nervous system, and of course, that's a terribly debilitating and socially difficult symptom. A number of women get recovery or better control over their bladder with cannabis. And finally, a number of people report that the ataxia is much improved. Their ability to navigate straight is much improved. So it's very clear that this, let me just show you a slide if I may. Is it on? Mark? You get some assistance up here, please. It needs to be turned on. I don't think I can turn it on from here.
It's on.
It is? All right, let's see what happens. Very good. This is, again, there's very little in the medical literature about this. But this is from a paper that was published in the Journal of Neurology.
Sir, would you take your microphone up there with you? Is it going to be movable? I'm sorry, Doctor.
This was published in the Journal of Neurology a couple of years ago, and it shows what happens to hand. A tremor is another thing I should have mentioned that is helped very much by cannabis. And it shows, as it says, what happens. This is a recording of the tremor. There's the before, when it's tremor like this. This is on the morning before, and this was taken the morning before, and this is the evening after smoking one marijuana cigarette. And you can see how much that eliminated his tremor. Let's see. You need to point back there. I went the wrong way. And here's another patient, here's another paper on multiple sclerosis, which was published 10 years ago. And this involved the use of Marinol, or tetrahydrocannabinol. And you can see, this is what a sample of his handwriting looked like before he took the Marinol. Here he tried to make these concentric circles without, and this is the tremor recording we had here. And this is after 5 milligrams of Marinol. So you can see, with respect to tremor, this is a boon for these people. Thank you. That's slides.
By the way, Doctor, we will have a patient testify today. As a matter of fact, we'll be the last witness today in the afternoon session who is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. He's going to give us his story to that.
Excellent. Now then, very closely related to multiple sclerosis from the point of view of cannabis is paraplegia and quadriplegia. And there again, these people, you all know what paraplegics and quadriplegics are. These people, in their paralysis, one of the things they suffer from most is muscle spasm. It can be very, very painful. And again, largely through word of mouth, and many of these people are veterans, they have discovered that smoking cannabis makes all the difference in the world. In fact, it's said that in many VA hospital paraplegia wards, in many VA hospital paraplegia wards, the smell of cannabis is ubiquitous, and the doctors ignore the fact that these people are using the substance. Curiously, a number of them report that in addition to relieving the muscle spasm, many of them find that they can get an erection when they use cannabis. For example, I had one patient who had to inject prostaglandin into his penis to get an erection. If he smokes cannabis, he doesn't have to do that, and he can hold an erection long enough to have intercourse. And you can imagine how important it is to these young men to be able to discover this. Now, the next thing I'd like to go on to is AIDS. As you know, this illness was first reported in 1981, and the HIV virus was recognized in 1984. And at the present time in this country, about 150,000 people have died from this terrible disease. It's estimated that about 2 million people in this country are infected, and about 250,000 people are suffering from the disease. These people have discovered, well, first of all, I should say that nausea is one of the symptoms of the disease. Nausea is a side effect of AZT, which is the primary treatment or medicine for the disease. A new drug that was just reported in the New England Journal of Medicine last year by the name of Foscarnet, which is used in the treatment of megalovirus retinitis. About 20% of AIDS people get megalovirus retinitis, which will destroy their vision if it isn't treated. The Foscarnet is a very effective treatment for that, but it was also discovered that Foscarnet, for reasons which are uncertain, seems to prolong the life of people with AIDS. The trouble is it has severe nausea as a side effect. People with AIDS have discovered that cannabis is the best treatment for that nausea. It does more than that. These people also suffer from muscle spasms often. Many of them have diarrhea. And all of them, or almost all of them, certainly in the late stages of the disease, lose weight. Cannabis relieves all of that. Many of these people who were losing weight, it either retards the rate at which they're losing weight, or in some of them it actually allows them to build up weight. One of the people who contributed to this volume is a man we'll call Dr. Z. He's a physician who graduated from a prestigious medical school, went up to a small New England town, practiced medicine, contracted AIDS. And he, like so many of his colleagues, discovered by word of mouth that cannabis is useful. And but he no longer practices medicine, but he found that he couldn't deal with the anxiety of using this drug illicitly. And so he went to Amsterdam, and in fact he called me from Amsterdam and he said, you know, this is the first time. There he could smoke cannabis. He needed to smoke it about 3 to 4 times a day to keep these symptoms away. He was able to cut his diarrhea, in addition to the nausea and vomiting, in addition to the muscle cramps, which it relieved his diarrhea from a level of 10 to 12 stools a day to 2 to 3, and it made him feel energized. He said, you know, this is the first time that I feel as though I'm living with AIDS rather than dying with AIDS, which is the way I feel in New England. When he came back, he said, now what am I going to do about this? I don't want to get in trouble with the law. I suggested that he try Marinol. And this is a little diversion, but it points out some of the problems. So he asked his physician to prescribe Marinol. His physician said, oh, I wouldn't prescribe that, that's addicting. And finally, he brought in literature, I sent him material, he persuaded this physician to prescribe it. The physician would only prescribe 5 milligrams a day, but at least he prescribed. Then his next problem was to get a pharmacy to get the Marinol. He had to go to 4 pharmacies before finally some pharmacist would agree to do it. He used Marinol, he doubled the dose on his own. And then the last I heard from him, he decided he gets better relief from cannabis and he's just going to have to take his chances with the law. And now smokes cannabis for the best possible relief of his AIDS symptoms.
And I would bring out also that we anticipate having a witness today with a very far progressed case of AIDS, and he will be a testifier here today at the afternoon session.
Let me next address chronic pain. One of the 19th century, one of the most prominent 19th century uses of cannabis was for the treatment of pain. It is said that it was used on the battlefields of the Civil War in the form of tincture of cannabis. Cannabis isn't soluble in water, so it's an alcoholic solution of cannabis. And then in 1856, when the hypodermic syringe was introduced from England, and it made it possible to inject opiates. Opium drove cannabis off the fields of the Civil War. The price was that lots of people, that's why it's called, addiction was originally called soldier's disease. A lot of these people became addicted to the opioids. But cannabis does have a long history for the relief of pain. Now, it is not as powerful as the opioids. I mean, if you have a real severe pain, cannabis isn't going to do it. But it does do it for a lot of other things in a way that opiates won't do without any of the liabilities. It isn't addicting, it doesn't affect digestion the way opiates do, and so forth and so on. It's particularly useful for some particular kinds of pain, which I go into in the book, but I think given our limitation of time, I won't go into at this point. Now, another area where cannabis is useful is in the treatment of migraine headaches. As long ago as his 13th edition of his textbook of medicine, Sir William Osler said the best treatment for migraine is cannabis. Now, since that time, we have developed the synthetic treatments for cannabis, chiefly the ergot derivatives, ergot being a fungus that grows on rye, and there are some derivatives from that have been very helpful in the treatment of migraine. But cannabis has advantages over ergot. First of all, about 20% of people who have migraine don't get relief, at least 20%, from the ergotamines. Secondly, cannabis has the capacity to stave off a migraine headache. People who have migraine, there are a number of different kinds of migraine, but the classical one there is usually premonitory symptoms. That is, people can tell they're about to get it. These people smoke a joint quickly and they can obviate. They don't get the attack. If they smoke it late, they still get better pain relief from cannabis than those people do from ergotamine. And in fact, there's recently been published a paper which suggests that cannabis does get to the migraine. It has to do with the release of a neurotransmitter called serotonin, and there has recently been published a paper which addresses that and suggests that this is the mechanism by which cannabis works in the treatment of migraine. Now, let me talk about another thing, that is pruritus, or itching. See if I have a slide that might be useful here. Why doesn't it work now? Mark, did you get it working? I think I need the switch turned. Good. Here it is. This is a young woman with atopic dermatitis, and there are too many lights for you to see the details. But if you could see that, you would see that her whole face is covered with this terrible rash, and it isn't just her face, it involves her whole body. These people suffer terribly from the itching connected with this. They scratch. They can't help it. They scratch and scratch, and in fact, one of the patients mentioned in this book is a man who, when he was in the armed services, they were about to amputate both arms because he had scratched them to such a point and it became so infected they thought they couldn't save it. He, like this young woman, discovered that smoking cannabis eliminates the pruritus, the itching. And if you leave this alone, it doesn't go away, but it clears up to the point where it's cosmetically livable. So people with various kinds of severe itching, and this is much better than antihistamines. The other thing you can use for this kind of thing is cortisone derivatives, but there are serious side effects of the cortisones, and you can use them for just so long. This is again going to be a very important use of cannabis when it becomes an accepted medicine.
Dr. Grinspoon, if I may call your attention to the fact that we have about maybe 10 to 15 minutes for you to go, so if you could pace yourself accordingly, and obviously we want to leave some time for either the doctors or Ms. Wilder to ask any concluding questions or any specific questions while you finish the material.
Okay, now let me just go through these other things rapidly. If anybody has any questions, ask them. Another important use for cannabis is the treatment of menstrual cramps. There are many women who find that the treatment of choice for severe menstrual, and this has been known for a long time, and there are very many secret tokers in the United States today who about once a month find it very important to use cannabis. This is related to a use which was discovered in the West in the 19th century, but I'm sure it goes back many thousands of years, that one way of dealing with the pain of childbirth is to have the mother smoke cannabis. There are some wonderful 19th century descriptions of babies who were born. I mean, people, particularly today, who want to be awake when their babies are born, want to be there, and yet want to take the edge off the pain. Cannabis is a boon to those folks. And just as in the 19th century, the descriptions of the baby coming out nice and pink. When you use general anesthetics, the baby is kind of blue and anoxic at birth, and this is not the case with cannabis. Now, very briefly, I'm just going to almost list some other uses of cannabis. Asthma is going to be a very important use. Right now, cannabis is going to have to be developed because cannabis is also a bronchial irritant as well as a bronchodilator. And it's kind of a war between these two effects of cannabis. But clearly, research indicates that its effect on asthma is different from, it's a different effect than the commonly used beta agonists, which those of us who read the New England Journal of Medicine discovered last year a lot more risk to the use of beta agonists than we had previously believed. This works by a different mechanism, and I would be willing to bet a quarter that that's going to be important in the future. Insomnia is a symptom for which cannabis has been used for decades, and in fact, when cannabidiol, one of these cannabinoids, is separated from cannabis, as some Peruvian investigators have done, it will be the best treatment for insomnia. It's not addicting, there's no tolerance, there's no rebound phenomenon, as there are with the most commonly used soporifics now, namely the benzodiazepines. Now, there are other causes of nausea which are also important. One of them is, just to mention one, a rare disorder called hyperemesis gravidarum. This is the morning sickness that pregnant women get, magnified by an order of magnitude. These people get so sick that in the past, they can't eat, and in the past it was often necessary to do an abortion to save the life of the prospective mother. Nowadays, they hook in an intravenous feeding, but the person has to be in the hospital all this time and fed intravenously, and there are risks to that kind of feeding. There are people who now report that the way they've dealt with hyperemesis gravidarum is to smoke dope right through term. They're able to have their babies nice and healthy. I should just briefly mention there are some Czechoslovakian researchers who have demonstrated that cannabis has antimicrobial properties, particularly with respect to streptococcus. And in one paper, a pretty dramatic account of a pathologist who was infected, who was about to lose a thumb, and cannabis, because of the streptococci is so resistant nowadays to conventional antibiotics, and cannabis saved the day. And then finally, just let me mention dystonias. Dystonias are muscle spasms which cause people to be disfigured and to have great pain. We as psychiatrists, unfortunately, iatrogenically, impose dystonias on people when we prescribe these neuroleptic drugs for the treatment of serious psychoses. About 10 to 20% of these people who have to get them for a long period of time develop dystonias. And one would have imagined, again, if we lived in a world where cannabis, once these things were first noticed, that you would think that psychiatry would be all abuzz with interest in developing cannabidiol as an anti-dystonic medication, but of course nothing is being done. But I look to the future when we see this as another area where cannabis is useful.
Since I'm going to speak first, and I'm going to give each of these panel members a chance to ask any questions they may on anything that you've covered here, Doctor. I am interested in marijuana's effect on the symptoms of stress. And many people who I speak to in my study of this matter say that they believe that marijuana is an antidote to the internal stress. They may be speaking about personal angst, or this may be speaking about facing a free-floating anxiety or facing some sort of difficult task tomorrow, that they want to get some sleep tonight and want to relax prior to it. Does any of your research indicate that marijuana, ingesting herbal marijuana, is an antidote to stress?
Well, I think probably in the same way alcohol is. Many people come home from the office and have a drink, just kind of relax a bit with this. Many people find marijuana useful in exactly the same way that it does diminish that kind of stress.
In your studies, have you found any significant number of people, or any significant percentage of people you've spoken to who have displaced alcohol use in their life and taken up marijuana smoking to achieve that kind of stress relief?
Yes, there are people who have done just that. That was first written about in 1891 by a man by the name of Birch in England. But there are lots of people who have discovered that cannabis is a much healthier and more effective drug. For example, and many of them have given up alcohol altogether. I think Dr. Mikuriya will have something to say. He's written about that later on.
To your knowledge, is marijuana an effective therapy for alcoholism?
Again, I will defer to Dr. Mikuriya. I haven't looked at that in any detail, but I think he will have more to say about that.
At this time, then, Sue, I would invite you, any questions or take your time with him?
Well, at the moment, Gatewood, I think I'm going to defer to Dr. Simone, who I know has a number of questions over there.
Dr. D. Simone, please.
Well, I guess I can ask some of them now. When you talk about smoke, and again, we're talking about this group is a bunch of smokers outside. Most of the world does not smoke anymore, so smoking has a social connotation. And most of the drugs that are in medicine today come from a plant, so that what we do is extract what's in the plant, and then we give it as a pill. Why are you so set on having marijuana given as a cigarette when you could extract what's ever in it to give to someone as a pill?
Well, that's a good question, Dr. D. Simone. In discussing this with the head of the TV program, the head of the government program at Mississippi, Dr. El Solnay, he asked me the same question. And it's a particularly pertinent question this month because in Science, just last month, it was reported that, as many of you know, the receptor sites, it was discovered a year ago, last July, that receptor sites for cannabis are now, we know they exist in the brain. In other words, the brain has these keyholes, which can only, these nerves which will be turned on by cannabinoids. Everybody, well, how in the world? The brain get constructed so it has these. And then, of course, it became, the big search was, what are the endogenous cannabinoids? And just a few weeks ago in Science, a doctor, a divine from the National Institutes of Mental Health, reported that they had discovered one of these endogenous substances. They named it anandamide, and it is clearly an endogenous cannabinoid. And as the Science editorial went on, now it says it opens the door to finding other cannabinoids which will be useful therapeutically, but will not lead to the high or the intoxication. Now, and this was at Dr. El Solnay's place. He said, well, look, Dr. Grinspoon, why can't you wait until we isolate these things and then we can give this in pill form? Well, now, the answer to that is several-fold. One, how long is that going to take? There are over 60 of these. It's going to take a long time. In the meantime, people out there are suffering. Two, who's going to pay for it? As I mentioned to you, drug companies, the way drugs come into being in this country is, a drug company sees a way of making money. You can't patent marijuana. You may be able to get a use patent on some of the condiments, but you can't patent whole marijuana. Thirdly, it's very clear that some of these effects are not just the effect of a particular cannabinoid, but a number of cannabinoids which act synergistically. So not only would you have to isolate all of these, but then you would have to try them in different combinations to see what exactly leads to the effect on the ataxia, the salutary effect on the ataxia in multiple sclerosis. Now, the alternative is to say, look, cannabis does give this relief now. It's true there's a downside. You have to smoke it, and there's no other medicine that is smoked. But given how little is required to smoke, the pulmonary risks are certainly not great for cannabis. If they're significant for recreational users who use an awful lot, and I'm very doubtful if that's true, they're insignificant for people who use it as a medicine. And why should we wait? And finally, when we get to the point where we do all of this and have these things available as medicine, they're going to be very expensive because all this work is costing an awful lot of money. Whereas people can get relief from smoking cannabis. Finally, if you have a medicine which costs $9 a pill, and you have to take it 3 or 4 times a day, or you can go out in the backyard and grow some of this plant and save yourself a lot of money. I have a hunch, and for this reason, I don't think the drug companies are going to get very much involved in this.
Anything else, Dr. Grinspoon? Dr. Poundstone, do you have any questions on Dr. Mikuriya?
Since my clinical experience with this drug are limited, I really can't challenge anything that's come up so far. I'm still in the education phase on this.
I think we all are, and I think that this is just the man right here who can educate or at least bear the brunt of investigation, cross-examination. We're going to move directly from Dr. Grinspoon into our first medical witness. Dr. Grinspoon, I cannot tell you how personally honored and delighted I am that you decided to attend these hearings. I want to thank you very much. I think you represent all that's great about Western civilization in setting aside your own personal or subjective feelings and making a decision some while back to begin studying this on an objective basis. I think that you and your value your Hippocratic oath and your adherence to the duty, just as I think the adherence to the duty of the gentleman on this panel who have taken a Hippocratic oath will be highly commended. And on behalf of everybody here in the entire state of Kentucky, I want to thank you for making the appearance.
First of all, it's the #1 medicine on earth. A prosecutor asked me the other day, Gatewood, why do people smoke marijuana? And I said, because it's the #1 medicine for the #1 killer on earth, which is stress. People who smoke marijuana live a year to a year and a half longer than people who don't, because it helps you breathe and helps you think. And people find that relaxing.